"She has the manners of the great houses and the fortune of none," said Alaric, Duke of Gadsby, tilting his glass toward the candlelight, "which is why she suits an evening like this and no morning after. A pretty ornament, Wexcombe, nothing more. One does not marry the centerpiece." The laughter that answered him was easy and low, the laughter of men who had dined well and feared nothing. Alaric did not trouble to lower his voice, for it did not occur to him that anyone worth minding might be near enough to hear. He had said such things 100 times, in 100 drawing-rooms, and they had always drawn the same warm murmur of amusement. Wit cost him nothing, and it bought him the pleasant sensation of being the cleverest man at his own table. That sensation, he had come to believe, was very nearly the point of having a table at all. He reached for the decanter. The long dining room at Gadsby House glowed with the deep amber light of 100 wax candles, and the great mahogany table threw back their fire in a river of polished dark. Silver caught the flames and multiplied them. Down the length of the board sat 24 of the county's better families, the ladies in silk and the men in black, and somewhere among them, Alaric supposed vaguely, was the young woman he had just described. He had not looked to see. He had not needed to. She was Miss Rosamond Vane, a clergyman's daughter of good blood and no money, invited to make up the numbers and to play, later, upon the pianoforte, which she did more beautifully than anyone had a right to expect. It was only when the laughter thinned that he noticed the particular quality of the quiet that followed it. She was seated not, as he had assumed, far down the table, but nearer than he would have wished, close enough that the candle between them lit her face plainly. She had heard. He knew it at once and completely, the way a man knows he has stepped wrong on a stair. There was no mistaking what he saw, not tears, not the trembling lip he might have braced himself against and forgiven himself for. Miss Vane was looking at her plate. And then, without haste and without a sound, she set down her fork upon the rim of the porcelain, laid it precisely straight, and lifted her eyes to his. She smiled at him. It was a small smile and a gracious one, the sort a lady gives a host to signal that all is well and no one need be troubled. It held no anger. That was the terrible thing about it. Had she flushed, had she risen and named him a coward before the company, he might have laughed the moment off and let the evening close over it like water. But she only smiled, as one smiles at a thing one has finished with, and turned to Mrs. Fenwick beside her and said something about the lateness of the moon. Alaric drank and told himself it was nothing. The evening went on. There was more wine, and the ladies withdrew, and the men spoke of horses and of the price of wheat, and when at last the party reassembled in the long saloon there was music. Miss Vane played. She played a slow air he did not know, something old and northern, and the room fell still to listen, and Alaric stood by the cold hearth and watched her hands upon the keys and could not have said afterward a single word that was spoken to him during it. When she finished she rose and thanked her hostess, and moved through the room bidding her good nights with a composure so complete that he found himself waiting, absurdly, for her to reach him. She did not reach him. She left by the far door before her circuit brought her near, and it was done so smoothly that he was not sure anyone but himself had marked it. He told himself again that it was nothing. He went to his bed a little after 2 and lay a long time with his eyes open. He woke to gray light and the sound of a carriage on the gravel. By the time he had thrown up the window, the carriage was already turning out of the court, a plain hired thing, and he had only the briefest glimpse of a dark traveling cloak within it before the trees along the drive took it. He stood at the open window in his shirt-sleeves with the cold morning air pouring over him and understood, with a clarity that had nothing pleasant in it, that Miss Rosamond Vane had gone before sunrise, and that she had gone because of him, and that she had not given him the satisfaction of a scene to be sorry for. "Gone," he said to his valet, who had come in behind him. "Miss Vane, when?" "Before 6, your grace. She left her thanks with the housekeeper, and a note, I believe, for Mrs. Fenwick." "For me?" The valet hesitated. "No, your grace, not for you." Alaric turned from the window. It was, he thought, a very foolish thing to feel, this small cold drop in the chest at the words "not for you." He was the Duke of Gadsby. Women did not leave him notes. Women waited to be noticed by him and counted themselves fortunate in the noticing. That had been the shape of the world for the whole of his adult life, and it had not, until this precise gray morning, ever struck him as a shape that might be improved upon. He dressed and went down and found the house restored to its ordinary self, the great rooms swept, the candles cold in their sconces, the mahogany table bare and gleaming. Mrs. Fenwick, his sister's friend and the hostess of the gathering, was taking chocolate in the small parlor, and she looked up at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "You are up early, Alaric." "I understood Miss Vane had left us." "She had an early stage to catch," she said, "from Marbury. Her aunt in the north is unwell." Mrs. Fenwick stirred her cup. "That was the reason she gave." "And the reason she did not give." Mrs. Fenwick looked at him then, directly, and she was a woman who had known him since he was a boy and had never been much afraid of his consequence. "I think you know it better than I, my dear. You were not quiet last night, and she was not deaf." He said nothing. There did not seem to be anything to say that would not make him smaller than he already felt. "She is a good girl," Mrs. Fenwick went on more gently. "Poor as a wren and prouder than any peeress I ever met, and with more reason. She asked nothing of anyone here, and she was made a jest of at her host's own table, and she chose to leave rather than let it be seen to have touched her. I call that a great deal of dignity for a girl of 23 who has not 200 a year." She set down her cup. "You called her a centerpiece, I believe. An ornament one does not marry." "I did not know she was near." "No," said Mrs. Fenwick, "I am sure you did not, you so seldom do." He went out after that because he could not sit still, and had his horse saddled and rode a long way over the wet spring fields without any destination, and came back no better than he had gone out. The trouble, he found, was not that she had been offended. Everyone was offended by something, it passed. The trouble was the smile. He kept returning to it, that small gracious closing of the door of a smile, and the more he turned it over the more clearly he saw what it had contained, which was a verdict. She had heard him weigh her and find her wanting, and she had, in the space of a breath, weighed him in her turn and found him wanting also, and she had judged that no correction was worth the asking. She had simply written him off. A man of his rank was accustomed to being feared, flattered, courted, resented. He was not accustomed to being quietly set aside as not worth the effort of contempt. Rosamund Vane had set him aside like a fork upon a plate. Alaric came in from the fields and stood in the great hall of the house his fathers had built, the house that made him the sort of man whose careless words could carry down a table and be laughed at, and for the first time he could remember he felt the size of it around him not as a possession but as a kind of hollowness. He had said one does not marry the centerpiece. He had not, when he said it, been thinking of marriage at all, and certainly not of her. But he found now that he could not stop thinking of her, of the northern air she had played and the straightness of the fork she had laid down, and he was duke enough to know that a man who cannot stop thinking of a woman had best find out why, and honest enough, that gray day, to suspect that the why would not flatter him. He asked Mrs. Fenwick, before she left, where in the north Miss Vane's people were to be found. She told him, and she watched him closely as she told him, and there was something in her face that was not quite disapproval and not quite hope. "Whatever you mean to do," she said, "do not do it carelessly. She has had enough of that from you to last a lifetime." He did not go north at once. Some remnant of pride told him that a duke does not chase a clergyman's daughter across 3 counties on the strength of one bad night, and for the better part of a fortnight he obeyed it. He attended to his estate. He sat with his steward over the drainage of the low meadows. He dined out twice and made no jokes at anyone's expense, which his acquaintance found so unlike him that one lady asked with genuine concern whether he was unwell. But the thing would not leave him, and by the end of the fortnight he had come to understand something about himself that the smile had first pried open. He had spent 38 years being clever at other people, and it had never once occurred to him that the cleverness was a kind of theft. He had taken from Miss Vane, in the space of one careless sentence, the small dignity that was very nearly the only property she possessed, and he had spent it on the laughter of men he did not even much like. He had done it without malice. That was somehow the worst of it. Malice he could have repented of cleanly, but he had done it the way a man treads a flower into the path without seeing it, because he had never troubled to look down. He looked down now, and having looked he could not unsee. He tried once to explain the matter to Wexcombe, who had laughed loudest that night at the table. "Do you recall what I said of the vain girl?" he asked. Wexcombe did not. He had to be reminded, and when he was reminded, he laughed again and said it had been a very good hit, and could not for the life of him understand why Gadsby wore such a face over it. And Alaric, watching his friend's easy, uncomprehending mirth, saw as though in a glass the man he himself had been a month before, and did not know whether to be sick or ashamed, and settled on both. He went home early. He had begun to find the company of men who could not be wounded a poorer thing than he had ever supposed it. So in the third week he went north and told himself it was only to make an apology, which was owed and which a gentleman pays. He took no servant beyond his coachman. He put up at inns like an ordinary traveler, and found that he rather liked the anonymity of it, the way a man with no one to defer to him is left alone with his own thoughts, which in Alaric's case had lately become surprisingly poor company. The village where the Vanes had their living was called Nethercot, a grey stone place folded into a fold of the moors, with a church older than the Conquest and a parsonage beside it that had clearly not been mended in a generation. He did not go to the parsonage. Instead, he took a room at the one inn and made, over 2 days, the sort of quiet inquiries a man makes when he does not wish to announce himself, and what he learned rearranged a good deal of what he had assumed. Miss Vane's father, the Reverend Mr. Vane, had died the previous autumn. The aunt whose illness she had cited was real and poor, and lived alone in a cottage at the edge of the village, and Miss Vane had come north not to visit but to stay, because there was nowhere else and no one else, and because a woman without money and without a father must go where she is wanted or where she is needed, and she had chosen where she was needed. She kept the aunt's house. She taught the letters to the children of 2 farming families for a few shillings a quarter. She had, the innkeeper's wife told him, been meant to make a good marriage once, before the money went, and had borne the coming down of it without a word of complaint that anyone had ever heard. The living at Nethercot had passed to a stranger on her father's death, and the parsonage with it, and Miss Vane had gathered up her books and her father's sermons and her mother's few pieces of plate and walked out of the only home she had ever known with her head high, and had not been heard to weep, though the woman who told him this said she was sure the girl had wept where none could see, for no one bore such a thing dry-eyed who had a heart, and Miss Vane, whatever else she was, had a heart. Alaric sat in the low-beamed parlor of the inn with a mug of ale going flat before him and thought about the evening at Gadsby House, the silk and the silver and the 100 candles, and about the fact that Miss Vane had put on her one good gown and traveled to that glittering table and played her northern air for people who would forget her name by morning, and had done it, no doubt, for the small fee such an evening paid which she needed, and he had called her a centerpiece, an ornament one does not marry. He had looked at a woman doing the bravest and most graceful thing in the room, and had seen only a decoration. He had seen a well-set jewel, and never once wondered at the hand that had polished it, nor at what that hand had cost to keep so steady. He did not sleep that night either. In the morning he did a thing he had never done in his life, which was to walk, alone and unannounced and unassisted, to the door of a person who had every right to shut it in his face, and knock. It was not she who opened it, but a thin old woman with sharp eyes, who looked him up and down and knew him for a gentleman and possibly for more than that, and did not curtsy. "We want nothing," she said, and began to close the door. "I have come to see Miss Vane," said Alaric. "My name is Gadsby." The name landed. He saw it land, saw the old woman's eyes widen and then narrow, and understood that his name was known in this house and not kindly. She stood a moment, and then, without turning, called back into the dim interior, "Rosamond, there is a duke at the door for you." She said the word duke, as another woman might have said the word bailiff. There was a silence within, and then Miss Vane came to the door. She was in a plain gray stuff gown with a work apron over it and her sleeves turned back, and there was flour on her wrists, for she had been baking, and her hair was caught up simply with a few strands loose about her face, and she looked at him across the threshold of that poor cottage with exactly the same composure she had worn at the great table, neither more nor less. That steadiness undid him more than any reproach could have. She was not surprised to be poor. She was not ashamed to be found at her baking. She simply stood and waited and let him be the one who had to speak. "Miss Vane," he said, and found that the speech he had prepared over 3 counties had entirely deserted him. "I have come a long way to say something to you, and I find I do not know how to begin it except badly." "Then perhaps," she said, "your grace had better begin it and have done, so that we may both go back to our mornings." It was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was polite and final, the verbal cousin of the smile. He deserved it and he took it. "I said a cruel thing," he said. "At Mrs. Fenwick's table. I said it without knowing you were near, which is no excuse because I ought not to have said it whether you were near or in another country. I called you an ornament. I weighed you by your fortune, which is a contemptible way to weigh anyone, and I did it to make idle men laugh. I have thought of very little else since. I have come to tell you that I know what I did, and that I am ashamed of it, and to ask your pardon. I do not ask you to grant it. I only ask that you hear that it is asked." She looked at him for a long moment. The old aunt had withdrawn somewhere into the house, but he could feel her listening. "You rode from the south," Miss Vane said at last, "and put up at inns and walked to this door to tell me you are ashamed." "Yes." "Why?" The question was so simple that it stopped him. "Because it is true," he said. "That is not what I asked. Men say true things every day and trouble no one with them. I asked why you came." She was not sharp, she was only exact, the way she had laid the fork exactly straight. "You are a duke. There is no woman in 3 counties who would not tell you the fault was hers and the honor of your notice enough. You need not have come at all, so I should like to understand why you did." And Alaric, who had built a whole life on having the ready answer, stood on the doorstep of a moorland cottage with the wind coming down off the fells, and gave her the only answer he had, which was the truth he had been circling for 3 weeks and had not, until she asked it plainly, dared to say even to himself. "Because when you set down your fork and smiled at me," he said, "you decided I was not worth minding, and you were right, and I find I cannot bear to be the man you were right about." She did not answer him for a long time. The wind moved in the low grass of the moor, and somewhere a curlew cried its long falling cry, and Miss Vane stood in the doorway with the flower on her wrists and looked at him as though he were a sum she was working carefully to be sure of the answer. Then she stepped back and held the door. "You had better come in," she said, "before the whole village decides a duke has come to court the baker. Mind the beam." The cottage was 1 room below and a ladder to a loft above, and it was clean and poor and warmer than any room he owned. She set him a stool by the fire and gave him, without asking, a cup of the tea that had been steeping, and he took it, and the ordinariness of the courtesy struck him harder than grandeur ever had. She had nothing, and she had made him tea because he was cold and had come a long way, and that was simply what a decent person did. "I will tell you what I think, your grace," she said, sitting across from him with her hands folded in her lap, "and then you may go home. I do not think you a wicked man. I have known wicked men, and they trouble to be cruel, and you did not trouble at all. That is a smaller sin than wickedness and a harder one to mend, because a wicked man knows he has an enemy in himself, and a careless one does not. You have spent your life," she said, "among people who could not afford to be hurt by you, and so you never learned that you could hurt anyone. That is what your rank has cost you. It is a great deal to have paid for a joke." "I know it," he said. "Do you?" She tilted her head. "You have said the words very well, but I have had gentlemen apologize to me before for lesser things, and I have watched the apology please them more than it repaired me. An apology can be another kind of ornament, your grace. A pretty thing a man wears to feel well made. I should like to know that yours is not." He set down the cup. "How would you know it?" "I would not from words." She looked at the fire. "Time is the only honest witness, and I have no reason on earth to give a duke my time." It was, he understood, a dismissal and a fair one, and he might have risen and bowed and taken his empty cup of penance home to the south and told himself he had done the gentlemanly thing. Instead, he stayed on the stool. "Then let me earn it," he said. "Not your pardon, your time. Let me come again as a man and not a duke, and be judged by what I do and not by what I say, for as long as it takes you to be sure of me one way or the other. If I am the careless man you think, you will see it soon enough, and you may shut this door and I will never trouble you again. But if I am not, I should like the chance to prove it before you decide I am." She was quiet. The old aunt, who had been pretending to mend a stocking in the corner, made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "You would come here," Miss Vane said, "to Nethercot where there is nothing." "There is you," said Alaric, "which appears to be a good deal more than I have had in the South for some years." And for the first time since he had said the words at the great table, the composure moved on her face, not into a smile she gave him to be rid of him, but into something involuntary and quickly mastered, a warmth she had not meant to show. She looked down at her floured wrists. "You may come Thursday," she said. "For an hour, I make no promise beyond the hour." He came Thursday. He came the Thursday after. He learned to duck the beam without being told and to bring nothing that could be mistaken for a bribe, no baskets from the South, no gifts, for he had understood that a gift was only another way of making her small. He brought instead his attention, which he was discovering he had never truly given anyone. He listened. He learned that she had a dry wit she kept folded away, that she read Latin better than he did, that she grieved her father quietly and constantly, that she taught the farm children because she could not bear to see a mind go untended for want of a few shillings, and that she had never once, in all her coming down, pitied herself, which was the quality in her he came to prize above all the rest. He mended the aunt's roof. He did not send men to mend it. He learned from the village thatcher how it was done and made a poor job of it the first day and a better one the second, and Miss Vane stood in the yard and watched a duke on a ladder with straw in his hair and said nothing, but there was a light in her face that had not been there before. He carried water. He split wood badly. The village, which had begun by regarding him as a calamity, came round to regarding him as a curiosity, and then slowly as a man, which was the whole of what he had asked to be. There was one Thursday when the aunt took a fever, and Rosamond's steadiness at last showed its cost, for she sat up the whole of a night with the old woman and would not be sent to rest, and Alaric, who might once have summoned a physician by letter and thought his duty discharged, instead rode himself the long dark miles to Marbury and back and brought the doctor by the arm and sat the second night through in the corner keeping the fire, saying nothing, asking nothing. The aunt mended. And in the grey of the morning, worn past pride, Rosamond looked across the low room at the Duke asleep upright on the hard stool with soot on his cuffs, and did not wake him, and something in her that had been closed since a certain dinner opened by a hair's breadth, though she told no one, least of all him. Spring turned towards summer on the moor, and one long gold evening, walking with her along the beck where the water ran clear over the stones, Alaric stopped and turned to her, and did not reach for any clever thing to say. "I called you a centerpiece," he said. "An ornament one does not marry. I have spent a season learning how wrong I was, and I find I was wrong twice over. You are not an ornament, and you are the only woman I have ever met whom I could not live beside and remain a careless man because you will not let me. That is not a reason to marry, I know. It is only the truest thing I have. Rosamond. I am asking you to be my wife, and I am asking it knowing you may say no, and knowing I would deserve it, and hoping past all deserving that you will not." She did not answer at once. She looked at the water a long while, then she looked at him. "When you spoke at that table," she said, "I set down my fork, and I decided you were a man not worth the ruin of my evening, and I left, and I thought I should never think of you again." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not quite. "I was wrong about you also, it seems, for I have thought of you a great deal. And I have watched you these 2 months become, on a moorland cottage roof with straw in your hair, a better man than the one who dined off silver, and I find I do not want to be the woman who was right about the wrong man. So yes." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yes, Alaric, though I warn you, I shall go on setting down my fork whenever you deserve it, and you have married a woman who has had a great deal of practice at leaving rooms with dignity." "I shall spend my life," he said, taking her floured, work-worn hands in both of his, "making certain you never again have cause to leave one of mine." They were married in the old grey church at Nethercot, older than the Conquest, with the aunt in the front pew in a new bonnet that Rosamond had at last permitted, and the farm children strewing the path with more flowers, and no silk, and no silver, and 100 candles fewer than had burned at Gadsby House the night he had wounded her, and it was the finest evening of Alaric's life. He took her south afterward. He showed her the great mahogany table where he had said the careless words, and she looked at it a long moment, and then she laughed, truly laughed, and said it was a very good table for a large family, and they should fill it. And they did. In the years that came, the long room at Gadsby House glowed again with wax candles and warm laughter, but it was a different laughter now, for the man at the head of the table had learned to look down its length and see every face at it as a soul that could be gladdened or wounded by a word of his, and he chose, evening after evening, to gladden. He was never again called clever in the old cutting way. He was called, instead, kind, which he had come to understand was the harder and the rarer thing. Late in life, when their grandchildren asked the Duchess how she had come to marry so grand a man, she would set down whatever she held, and smile, the old small gracious smile, and say only that he had once said something so foolish that she had left before sunrise, and that it had turned out to be the wisest journey she ever took, for it had emptied him of his cleverness and left room for his heart. And Alaric, Duke of Gadsby, who had once believed the point of a great table was to be the wittiest man at it, would reach along the polished dark and take his wife's hand, and know past all doubting that the finest thing he had ever done was to be, for once in his life, worth the minding.